In ancient times, an act defined the connection between the divine and the earthly. Animal sacrifices began with a perfect choice. The journey to Jerusalem was a path of personal sacrifice and faith, traveled by thousands. An encounter between human sacrifice and sacred ritual. This is how the sacrifices began, from the moment they were handed over to the Kohen.
Shalom, Shalom. Welcome to your channel, Mishnah TV. Thank you for being here now. Imagine entering a room filled with smoke, fire, and reverent silence. In the center is an altar. A priest holds a knife. An animal is presented as an offering. The blood touches the altar, and the fire consumes the sacrifice. If a modern observer were to enter there, they would likely ask an immediate question: what is happening here? That is exactly what happens when we come to Parashah Vayikra, the first portion of study from the biblical book of Leviticus. After all the epic narrative of the Exodus, the departure from Egypt, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai engulfed in flames, the Torah abruptly shifts its tone. Suddenly, there are no more stories. There are instructions, minute details, blood, fat, fire, sacrifices. And then the mystery arises. Why does the Torah dedicate entire pages or lines to describing animal sacrifices? What does a korban truly mean? Is it an ancient ritual with no relevance today? Or does it conceal one of the deepest spiritual ideas in the entire Torah? The sages asserted something surprising. Sacrifices aren't about animals, they're about human beings. Maimonides said they were a strategy for transforming a pagan culture. Nachmanides responded that each sacrifice symbolically represents the life of the sinner. And the mystical tradition went even further. It maintained that each offering brings about reparation in the spiritual universe. So the question is no longer just what they were doing on the altar in the Mishkan. The question is different. What part of us was meant to burn on that altar? Because if Leviticus is correct, the true sacrifice was never the animal. The true sacrifice is the human ego. And that is precisely what we will explore today. Because if you stay for this class, you'll learn what Korbanot meant in the Hebrew mindset and what the different types of sacrifices were that were offered in the temple, because not all of them were the same, according to the original Hebrew text of the Torah. This is Abel Flores, journalist and founder of Mishnah TV. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already and give us a like. Also, remember to visit our website, lemishnah.com, where you'll find much more material on all these topics and our complete, free course on the entire Mishnah. When we hear the word sacrifice, we often imagine loss, blood, smoke, and a distant scene, almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. But therein lies the error, and also the teaching. For at the heart of biblical Judaism, the system of Korbanot was not a cult of destruction, but a language of closeness. The system of Korbanot constitutes the core of the Second Temple worship and is described primarily in the Book of Leviticus. And here it is worth pausing, because words in the tradition of Israel are never merely decorative. The Hebrew word korban comes from the root, karav, which means to approach, to draw near, not to annihilate, not to disappear, not to impress God with a dramatic act, as if the Creator required a spectacle. Rather, the fundamental purpose of the sacrifice was not the destruction of the animal, but to bring humankind closer to God. That idea completely changes the perspective. The korban was, in essence, a spiritual bridge, a ritual act that translated into visible gesture and inner need, to return, to give thanks, to make amends, to consecrate. In other words, the focus was not on the animal. The focus was on the human heart. The smoke rose, yes, but what truly had to rise was consciousness. This sacrificial system functioned during two major periods in the history of Israel. The First Temple, roughly between 960 and 586 BCE, and the Second Temple, from 516 BCE to 70 CE. That is to say, for entire centuries, the people of Israel structured their spiritual, national, and liturgical life around this service. The service was conducted by the Kohanim, the priests, and overseen by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. It was not religious improvisation, it was a sacred structure. And perhaps therein lies the deepest lesson. Approaching God was not a chaotic impulse, but a discipline of the soul. Because holiness, in Judaism, is not merely felt, it is also ordered. Let us imagine for a moment the courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem, not as a chaotic scene, but as a carefully choreographed dance. Every gesture had meaning, every step a spiritual intention. Because in the biblical tradition, ritual is not religious theater, it is a pedagogy for the soul. The structure of the sacrificial ritual followed a precise procedure, passed down through generations and described in detail in the Book of Leviticus. It all began with the selection of the animal. It had to be an animal without blemish. In Hebrew, tamim, whole. Why? Because what is offered to the sacred must reflect integrity. One does not offer God what is left over, one offers the best. Then came a profoundly symbolic moment, the laying on of hands by the offerer on the animal. This gesture, known as semika, was not decorative. The offerer placed their hands on the animal's head, identifying with the offering. It was a symbolic transfer. The person acknowledged their responsibility, their gratitude, or their need for atonement. The sacrifice did not replace the human being, it represented him. Then came the shechita, the ritual slaughter. This act had to be performed with extreme precision and speed, minimizing the animal's suffering. In fact, the laws of shechita are considered among the oldest ethical regulations related to the treatment of animals. Next, the priest collected the blood in a special vessel. And here a central element of biblical theology appears. Leviticus declares, "For the blood is the life." Leviticus 17 verse 11. Therefore, the blood was not consumed, it was offered. The priest then sprinkled the blood on the altar. This act marked the culmination of the ritual, symbolizing purification, reconciliation, and renewal of the bond between humankind and God. Finally, specific parts of the animal were burned on the altar. The rising smoke was not understood as divine nourishment, but as a symbolic expression, the transformation of the material into spiritual elevation. This entire process took place at the mizbech, the main altar, located in the temple courtyard. The mizbech was the operational heart of the sanctuary. There, human gesture, priestly discipline, and spiritual intention converged. And perhaps that is the most subtle teaching of the entire sacrificial system. Approaching God was not an isolated emotional moment. It was a process, step by step, awareness upon awareness. Because profound spirituality, like the temple ritual, always has structure. And when the structure is correct, the soul knows how to ascend. Now, if we open the book of Leviticus carefully, we discover that the system of Korbanot, offerings, was not a uniform practice. There was a precise, almost pedagogical structure that organized the different ways in which human beings could approach God. The Torah describes 5 fundamental categories of offerings, each with a distinct spiritual purpose. The first is the olah, the burnt offering. In this sacrifice, the animal was completely burned on the altar. The word olah means that which ascends. Everything rises in smoke. It represents total surrender, an expression of absolute dedication to God. The second is the mincha, the grain offering. It did not include animals, but rather fine flour, oil, and incense. It was, in essence, an offering of gratitude, accessible even to those who could not bring livestock. The third is the shalomim, the peace offering or communion offering. Here, part of the animal was offered on the altar, and another part was consumed in a ritual meal. It was a celebration of harmony between God, the offerer, and the community. The fourth is the jatat, the sin offering. It was offered when someone committed an unintentional transgression, seeking to restore spiritual balance. And finally, the asham, the reparation offering. This was linked to specific transgressions that required not only sacrifice, but also restitution. 5 offerings, 5 different paths, but one same purpose: to bring humanity closer to the sacred. Because, in the end, every korban is exactly that, a movement of the soul that decides to draw closer again. There is a type of offering in the Torah that, more than a ritual, seems like a radical declaration of surrender. It is called olah, and its very name contains the key to its meaning. The word olah comes from the Hebrew verb Allah, which means to rise, to ascend. This is no coincidence. This sacrifice receives this name because it rises entirely in smoke to the heavens. Nothing is withheld, nothing is shared, nothing returns to humankind. The olah is the sacrifice completely consumed by fire. Unlike other korbanot, where certain parts could be eaten by the priests or even by the offerer, in the olah the animal is completely burned on the altar. No part is consumed as food. Everything is given away, and there we find its profound spiritual meaning. The olah represents absolute surrender to God. In practical terms, the Torah permitted different animals for this offering. A bull, a sheep, or a goat could be offered. But biblical law, with a remarkable social sensitivity for its time, also considered those with fewer resources. That is why it permitted offering doves or turtle doves. In this way, no one was excluded from the act of approaching the sacred. Spirituality, in Israel, was never an economic privilege. The ritual process followed the structure we already know. The offerer presented the animal, placed their hands over it, what in Hebrew is called semicha, and then the shechita, the ritual slaughter, was performed. Afterward, the priest handled the blood, and finally the animal was placed on the mizbeach, the altar, and then the central moment occurred. The fire consumed it completely. Now, if we look at it superficially, we might think that the act simply consists of burning an animal. But Jewish tradition insists that the true sacrifice was never the animal. The true sacrifice was always internal. The olah symbolizes that the person offers, symbolically, their entire life and their entire will. It is as if the offerer were saying, "Just as this offering rises completely, so too do I wish to elevate my entire being toward the divine." In other words, the fire on the altar represents the fire of spiritual transformation. The sages of classical Judaism understood this dimension very well. The Midrash teaches that God needs neither flesh nor smoke. What he seeks is the intention of the heart. The ritual is the visible language of an invisible decision. And here a fascinating paradox arises. The olah is the sacrifice from which no one eats. Yet it is precisely the one that most deeply nourishes the soul. Because when a person decides to give something without expecting anything in return, without personal gain, without immediate reward, they are performing one of the rarest and most sublime acts of human experience. That is the olah. It is not just fire on an altar. It is the image of a life that chooses to rise. There is a detail in the Book of Leviticus that often goes unnoticed, but it reveals something profoundly human within the sacrificial system. Not all offerings involved animals, and this exception opens a window into the social and spiritual sensitivity of the Torah. This offering is called mincha. The mincha is the grain offering. Unlike other korbanot, it does not include animals. There is no slaughter, no blood, no livestock. Instead, we find simple, everyday, almost humble ingredients. The basic components were fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense. 3 elements that, in the ancient world of Israel, represented the foundation of agricultural and domestic life. Flour was the essential food. Oil symbolized abundance and blessing. And frankincense added an aromatic dimension that transformed the act into something solemn and sacred. The procedure also had its own structure. Part of the offering was burned on the altar, on the mizbeach, rising in smoke as a memorial before God. But another part was consumed by the priests, the kohanim, who served in the temple. This detail is important. Unlike the olah, which is completely consumed, the mincha establishes a kind of balance. One part ascends to the divine, and another sustains those who dedicate their lives to sacred service. Now, why does the Torah include this type of offering? The answer becomes clear when we consider who could bring it. The mincha was accessible to the poorest. Not everyone could offer a bull or a sheep. Livestock was expensive, but practically anyone could bring a handful of flour. And here we find one of the most elegant ethical principles of biblical tradition. Access to God does not depend on economic power. The value of the korban was not in its price, but in the intention behind it. A valuable animal offered without a heart held less significance than a handful of flour offered sincerely. In fact, the sages of the Talmud go so far as to say something surprising. When a poor person brings a mincha, the Torah considers it as if they had offered their very soul, because that small gesture represents, proportionally, all that they can give. In symbolic terms, The mincha represents gratitude and daily dedication. It doesn't necessarily arise from a spiritual crisis or a specific sin. Rather, it is an everyday expression of recognition. It is the gesture of one who says, "Everything I have, even the simplest things, comes from God." And perhaps that is why its ingredients are so simple: flour, oil, incense. Nothing spectacular, nothing dramatic. But hidden within that simplicity is a profound teaching. Spirituality doesn't always manifest itself in extraordinary moments. Sometimes it appears in the most modest gestures of daily life. A handful of flour, offered with awareness, can become a sacred act. Within the system of Korbanot, there is a particularly revealing sacrifice because it transforms the ritual act into an experience of communion. It is not merely an offering ascending to heaven, nor simply an act of moral reparation. It is, literally, a sacred meal shared. This sacrifice is called shalomim. The word shalomim comes from the Hebrew root shalom, and here we find one of those subtleties of biblical Hebrew worth savoring. Shalom does not simply mean peace in the sense of the absence of conflict. It signifies wholeness, completeness, harmony, something whole, balanced. That is why the shalomim sacrifice is often translated as a peace offering or a communion sacrifice. Unlike the olah, which is completely burned, or other sacrifices with specific expiatory functions, the shalomim establishes a very particular distribution of the sacrificed animal. One part is offered on the altar, on the mizbeach, ritual offering. Another part is given to the priests, the kohanim, who serve in the temple, and a third is consumed by the offerer and their family. In other words, the sacrifice becomes a sacred meal. This is extraordinary from both an anthropological and theological perspective. The altar receives its portion, the priests receive theirs, and the community participates as well. God, the sanctuary, and the people symbolically share the same table. The act of eating, which in any culture is a gesture of conviviality, is transformed here into a religious expression. Eating together is a declaration of peace, relationship, and closeness. Within the category of shalomim, we find three main subtypes. The first is todah, the offering of thanksgiving. It was offered when a person experienced a particular salvation, having survived danger, illness, or a perilous journey. It was a ritual way of expressing gratitude. The second is neder, the vow. Here, the sacrifice was offered in fulfillment of a promise made to God. That is, the person had made a spiritual commitment and now fulfilled it publicly. The third is nedava, the voluntary offering. This is perhaps the most beautiful in its simplicity. It doesn't respond to a crisis, nor to a prior promise. It is simply a spontaneous act of devotion. If we observe the symbolism of the shalomim, we discover something profoundly human. It represents the harmony between three fundamental dimensions. First, the relationship with God, represented by the portion offered on the altar. Second, the institutional dimension of worship, represented by the priests. And third, the human community, represented by the offerer and those who participate in the sacred meal. God, priests, and people. Three levels that connect in a single act. In a sense, the shalomim reminds us that biblical spirituality is not only an individual ascent toward the divine, it is also community, celebration, and shared gratitude. Because when there is true shalom, holiness does not separate people. It brings them together around the same table. Within the system of Korbanot, there is a category that reveals one of the Torah's deepest moral insights, the recognition that human beings can err, even unintentionally. This sacrifice is called chatat, the sin offering. The word comes from the Hebrew root chata. Interestingly, in biblical Hebrew, this verb doesn't simply mean to sin. It literally means to miss the mark, like an archer who shoots an arrow and misses the center of the target. The image is powerful. Sin, from this perspective, is not always conscious rebellion. Often it is simply a deviation, a human error. That is why chatat was intended to atone for sins committed unintentionally. The Torah clearly distinguishes between deliberate transgressions and unintentional errors. When a person erred unintentionally, the sacrificial system offered a way to restore spiritual balance. Now, something very interesting occurs in the legislation of chatat. The type of sacrifice varied depending on who had committed the transgression. Not all sins had the same social or spiritual dimension. If the one who sinned was the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, the sacrifice had to be particularly significant. His position represented the entire nation, so his sin had collective repercussions. If the sin was committed by the entire community of Israel, the Torah also prescribed a specific sacrifice. This reminds us that nations, just like individuals, can err. If the one who sinned was a leader of the people, the sacrifice also had its own form. Because leadership implies expanded responsibility, the decisions of the leader affect many. And finally, we find the case of the common individual, the ordinary person who, at some point, committed an unintentional transgression. This gradation is extraordinarily sophisticated. The Torah recognizes that moral responsibility is linked to the role each person occupies within society. The ritual of the chada also had a distinctive feature. The handling of the blood was more complex than in other sacrifices. Depending on the case, the priest could sprinkle the blood in different places within the sanctuary, even in front of the temple veil or on the horns of the altar. Why such precision? Because in biblical theology, blood symbolizes life. And when life is used within the ritual, the act aims to restore what human error has disrupted. The ultimate purpose of the ritual was not to punish or humiliate the offerer. It was to restore spiritual balance. We could put it another way. The system did not seek to condemn the human being for making a mistake. It sought to teach them how to realign themselves. And perhaps therein lies one of the most modern teachings of the entire biblical tradition. Human error does not have to be the end of a story. It can become the beginning of correction. Because in Judaism, even when the arrow misses the target, there is always the possibility of aiming again.
In ancient times, an act defined the connection between the divine and the earthly. Animal sacrifices began with a perfect choice. The journey to Jerusalem was a path of personal sacrifice and faith, traveled by thousands. An encounter between human sacrifice and sacred ritual. This is how the sacrifices began, from the moment they were handed over to the Kohen.
There is a moral principle in the Torah that feels surprisingly modern. Not every sin is resolved with repentance alone. When a transgression causes real harm, spirituality demands more than words. It demands reparation. And it is precisely here that a very particular type of sacrifice appears within the system of Korbanot. It is called asham, the guilt offering. The Hebrew word asham comes from a root that indicates responsibility, moral debt, concrete guilt. It is not simply a matter of having strayed from the path, as in the case of chadat. Here we are talking about a transgression that has tangible consequences, especially when there is financial loss or breach of trust. That is why asham was offered in very specific situations. One typical case was the misuse of sacred objects, which in biblical law is called milah. This occurred when someone used something consecrated to the temple for personal purposes. It was not simply a ritual transgression. It was a violation of what belonged to the sacred. Another case involved fraud or deception between people. The Torah mentions situations where someone denies receiving a deposit, manipulates a transaction, or appropriates something that doesn't belong to them. In other words, Hashem also addressed ethical transgressions in social life. A third scenario was false oaths. When a person invoked God's name to uphold a lie, the damage wasn't just interpersonal. It also affected trust in sacred language. In all these cases, the Torah establishes something extraordinary. Sacrifice alone wasn't enough. In addition to korban, the guilty person had to return what was stolen or repair the damage caused. And not only that, they had to add an extra 20% to the original value, an additional fifth. Why that extra percentage? Because restitution wasn't to be merely neutral. The process had to acknowledge the harm done and demonstrate a genuine intention to repair the relationship. In this way, asham combines two fundamental dimensions, atonement and restitution. The sacrifice addresses the spiritual dimension of the transgression. It acknowledges that the wrong has affected the relationship between humanity and God. But making amends addresses the ethical and social dimensions. It recognizes that sin also affects other people. In contemporary terms, we could say that the Torah establishes a principle of restorative justice here. It is not enough to ask for forgiveness. The damage must be repaired. And perhaps that is the most powerful teaching of asham. Authentic spirituality is not limited to inner feelings. It also manifests itself in concrete actions that restore balance to life. Because when wrongdoing has broken something in the world, true teshuva, return, begins when we dare to rebuild it. When we study the system of Korbanot, we usually focus on the 5 main categories described in the Book of Leviticus. However, the temple service also included other fundamental sacrifices that sustained the spiritual rhythm of Israel's national life. Some of these were not tied to a particular individual situation, but rather to time itself. One of the most important was the korban tamid. The word tamid means continuous or constant, and that perfectly defines its function. The korban tamid was the daily obligatory sacrifice that marked the ongoing pulse of the temple service. 2 lambs were offered each day. One was sacrificed in the morning at the beginning of the day, the other in the afternoon as the day drew to a close. In this way, the sanctuary was never spiritually inactive. The fire on the altar remained burning, and the divine service maintained a constant flow. The tamid served as a reminder that the relationship between the people and God did not depend solely on extraordinary moments. It was a continuous relationship, sustained day after day. Alongside this daily sacrifice, there was another category called musaf, which literally means additional. Musaf sacrifices were offered on special days, when the sacred calendar marked moments of heightened spiritual intensity. These included Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the new month, and the major biblical festivals. During Passover, for example, additional sacrifices were offered that reflected the historical and spiritual significance of the celebration. But within this festival, a sacrifice with entirely unique characteristics emerged, the Passover sacrifice, the Korban Pesach. Unlike other Korbanot, this one was not reserved exclusively for the altar or the priesthood. Every family participated directly. Each household sacrificed a lamb, which was then consumed during the Passover meal. This transformed the ritual into a collective experience of historical remembrance. It was not merely a liturgical act of the temple. It was a domestic celebration that commemorated the exodus from Egypt, the liberation, and the birth of the people of Israel. Thus, the sacrificial system not only regulated individual acts of devotion or atonement, but also organized time, memory, and the identity of the people. Because in the biblical vision, the sacred does not reside solely within the space of the temple. It also lives in the rhythm of the day, the month, and the year. And each sacrifice, in one way or another, taught humankind to remember that their entire life could become an act of drawing closer to God. When the Torah regulates the system of korbanot, sacrifices, it leaves no room for improvisation. Even the animals that could be offered were carefully defined, and this detail reveals something important. In biblical thought, the sacred demands precision. The animals suitable for sacrifice belonged to a very specific group. The Torah mentions cattle, sheep, goats, turtle doves, and pigeons. That is, domestic animals common within the pastoral economy of ancient Israel. This is no coincidence. The sacrificial system was designed to integrate with the daily life of the people. It did not require exotic or impossible to obtain creatures. The animals came from the same agricultural and livestock raising world in which Israelite families lived. However, not just any animal could be presented on the altar. The first condition was that it be without physical defects. In Hebrew, the word tamim is used, which means whole, complete, without visible imperfection. A lame, sick, or mutilated animal was not acceptable for sacrifice. This requirement had a profound symbolic meaning. The offering had to reflect the best of what the person possessed. One did not offer to God what was already damaged or discarded. The second condition was the specific age of the animal. Depending on the type of sacrifice, the Torah established minimum ages to ensure the animal was in suitable condition. And finally, there was ritual purity. The animal had to belong to species considered pure according to biblical law. This connected the sacrificial system to the broader set of kashrut laws, which regulated the relationship between diet, sanctity, and spiritual discipline. Thus, even in a seemingly technical aspect, the selection of the animal, we find an ethical lesson. Biblical spirituality insists on something very simple and very demanding at the same time. When human beings decide to approach the sacred, they do so by offering the best they have. Because the quality of the offering always reflects the depth of the intention. There is one element in the entire sacrificial system that may seem perplexing to the modern reader, but which held central significance in the biblical mindset. That element is blood. In the Book of Leviticus, we find a key statement that illuminates the entire ritual. The life of the flesh is in the blood. This is stated in Leviticus 17 verse 11. In the Torah's view, blood is not simply a biological fluid. It represents life itself, the vital principle that animates the living being. This is why blood occupies such a delicate place within biblical law. Precisely for this reason, two fundamental things occur. First, the blood was offered to God within the sacrificial ritual. When the priest collected the animal's blood and sprinkled it on the altar, he was not performing an arbitrary gesture. He was symbolizing that life, ultimately, belongs to the Creator. The blood, by touching the altar, represented the return of life to its source. And second, the Torah strictly forbids the consumption of blood. This prohibition appears repeatedly in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy. It wasn't simply a dietary rule, but a theological principle. Humans can consume meat, but the life represented by the blood belongs only to God. Therefore, in the temple ritual, the most significant moment wasn't necessarily the burning of the animal, but the act of sprinkling the blood on the altar. That gesture symbolized something profoundly spiritual, surrendering one's life to the Creator, acknowledging that all human existence depends on Him. In other words, the sacrifice didn't teach that God needed blood. It taught that life doesn't belong entirely to us. And when humanity recognizes that, true reverence begins. When the sages of Israel reflected on the sacrificial system, they didn't all interpret it in the same way. And that is precisely what is fascinating about Jewish tradition. The Torah is studied, discussed, and analyzed from multiple perspectives. Throughout history, different philosophical interpretations arose to explain the profound meaning of the Korbanot, sacrifices. One of the best known is the rational interpretation associated with the great medieval philosopher Maimonides, known in Hebrew as Rambam. In his work Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides proposes a surprisingly psychological and historical reading. He argues that the sacrifices were a pedagogical tool. Let's consider the context of the ancient Near East. All the surrounding cultures practiced ritual sacrifices. If the Torah had completely eliminated that religious language, the change would have been too radical for the mentality of the time. According to Maimonides, God permitted sacrifices but redirected them toward a regulated and monotheistic system with the aim of leading Israel away from idolatry. In other words, the ritual functioned as an educational transition toward a higher form of spirituality. But not all sages agreed with this explanation. The great medieval commentator Nachmanides, known as Ramban, defended what we might call a traditional interpretation. For him, the sacrifice has a profoundly symbolic meaning related to moral responsibility. According to Nachmanides, when a person brings a korban, offering, they must understand something unsettling yet transformative. What happens to the animal should have happened to them. The fire, the blood, the altar, all represent the judgment the sinner deserved. However, the sacrifice acts as a symbolic substitute. In this way, the offerer acknowledges their error and experiences a form of profound repentance. The ritual becomes a moral mirror. And then we find a third interpretation, even deeper in its symbolic language, the mystical interpretation developed in the Kabbalistic tradition. According to Kabbalah, sacrifices do not only affect the visible world, they also generate tikkun, that is, spiritual restoration in the higher realms. The universe, in this view, is composed of multiple levels of spiritual reality. Human actions, especially those performed with sacred intention, can restore balance between these levels. In this context, the smoke rising from the sacrifice is not merely a physical phenomenon. It represents spiritual elevation, the ascent of the energy of the human act toward the divine dimensions. Thus, three distinct interpretations emerge within Judaism, a pedagogical one, a moral one, and a mystical one. But curiously, all three coincide on something fundamental. Sacrifices were never simply external acts. They were always, in essence, a spiritual language that sought to transform human beings. There is a moment in Jewish history that marks a radical shift. almost unthinkable for those who lived in the world of the Second Temple. For centuries, the system of Korbanot, sacrifices, had been the heart of Israel's worship. But that system came to an end with a dramatic historical event. In 70 CE, the Roman Empire destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. With the fall of the sanctuary, the altar, the mizbech, the unique place where sacrifices could be offered, also disappeared, and with it ended the sacrificial system that had functioned for centuries. One might think that this meant the collapse of Judaism. Without a temple, without an altar, and without sacrifices, the center of worship seemed to vanish. But something extraordinary happened. The sages of Rabbinic Judaism reinterpreted the spiritual life of the people and constructed a new form of service to God. Instead of depending on animal sacrifice, Judaism began to organize itself around three fundamental pillars. The first was prayer. Tefillah became the new language of approaching God. The second pillar was the study of Torah. Reflection, debate, and learning were transformed into a form of spiritual service. And the third pillar was acts of justice and kindness, what tradition calls Gemilut Chassidim, concrete actions of help and compassion toward others. The Talmud establishes a very interesting connection between the past and this new reality. The sages taught that the daily prayers symbolically correspond to the daily sacrifices of the temple. The morning prayer reflects the morning sacrifice. The afternoon prayer recalls the evening sacrifice. In other words, the fire on the altar was replaced by the words of the heart. Thus, Judaism demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. Without the temple, without sacrifices, and without an altar, the relationship with God did not disappear. It was transformed. Because in the end, the true purpose of the Korbanot, sacrifices, was always to bring human beings closer to the divine. And that approach can be expressed in many ways. Sometimes with fire on an altar, and sometimes with a prayer spoken in silence. There is a dimension to the Korbanot system that is not immediately apparent. When we read the Book of Leviticus, we see rituals, animals, priests, fire, and blood. But the mystical tradition of Judaism maintains that all of that was merely the visible surface of a much deeper process. Kabbalistic literature, and especially the Zohar, the foundational work of Jewish mysticism, proposes a radically different interpretation. According to this tradition, the Korbanot were not simply religious rituals performed in the Temple of Jerusalem. They were acts that triggered spiritual movements on multiple levels of the universe. In the Kabbalistic view, reality is not composed of a single plane. There is the material world that we perceive with our senses, but there are also spiritual worlds, levels of reality where what Kabbalah calls Shifa, divine energy, circulates. Within this conceptual framework, the temple altar, the mizbech, was not simply a stone structure. It was considered a point of connection between the material world and the higher spiritual dimensions, a true axis between the earthly and the celestial. When a sacrifice was performed with the right intention, what in Hebrew is called kavana, the act generated a kind of spiritual resonance. The smoke rising from the altar symbolized more than just the combustion of an animal. It represented the elevation of the energies of the material world to the divine spheres. From this perspective, the temple functioned as a cosmic center of spiritual balance. Each sacrifice contributed to restoring harmony among the different levels of creation. Therefore, in the Kabbalistic tradition, the sacrificial system was never understood simply as a set of ancient rites. It was a complex spiritual mechanism designed to repair invisible fractures in the fabric of the universe. From this mystical vision arose various teachings that attempt to explain the hidden meaning of sacrifices. The Kabbalistic tradition organizes these ideas into several symbolic principles. Below, we will explore 7 mystical principles that, according to this tradition, reveal the deepest meaning of the sacrificial system. Each of them will allow us to understand why, for the mystics of Israel, the altar of the temple was not just a place of ritual, but a true portal between worlds. There is a central idea in Jewish mysticism that completely changes our understanding of the sacrificial system. According to Kabbalah, the universe is not a cold, automatic mechanism. It is a living spiritual organism, sustained by flows of divine energy. This system, explains the Kabbalistic tradition, is structured through the sphirot, the divine emanations through which the Creator's energy manifests in reality. They are not gods or separate entities. Rather, they are spiritual channels through which the divine presence organizes and expresses itself in the world. The Sphirot form a kind of invisible architecture that sustains creation. Now, here emerges a profoundly bold assertion of Kabbalistic thought. Human actions affect this system. When human beings act with justice, compassion, and spiritual awareness, the flow between the Sphirot remains harmonious. But when sin occurs, what in Hebrew we call chet, a deviation from the divine order, an imbalance is created within this spiritual structure. The universe, in a sense, becomes unbalanced. This is where the Kabbalistic concept of tikkun comes in, meaning repair, restoration, correction. The spiritual mission of humankind consists precisely in participating in the repair of these fractures. And according to the Zohar, the great classic of Jewish mysticism, the Korbanot fulfilled exactly that function. When a sacrifice was performed in the temple with the proper intention, with kavana, spiritual awareness, it was not simply a visible ritual act. It was an act of cosmic repair. The sacrifice produced tikkun, restoring the spiritual flow between the Sphirot. The smoke rising from the altar symbolically represented the elevation of energy from the material world to higher levels. Human actions, performed on the physical plane, generated effects on the spiritual planes. Therefore, sacrifice was not understood merely as an individual practice of atonement. From the Kabbalistic perspective, the act affected the very order of the universe. The offerer came to the temple seeking to correct their own transgression, yes. But in doing so, he was also participating in a much broader repair. He was contributing to restoring harmony between the worlds. It's an extraordinary idea. Human beings, seemingly small within the immensity of the cosmos, possess the capacity to influence the spiritual structure of creation. Every act can repair or disrupt. And perhaps that is the most profound teaching of this mystical principle. Our actions don't end with ourselves. They resonate throughout all of reality. Because, according to Kabbalah, the entire universe is constantly waiting to be repaired. There is a powerful image within Jewish mystical literature that completely transforms our understanding of the temple in Jerusalem. For the Kabbalistic tradition, the Mizbech, the altar of sacrifice, was not simply a stone platform where offerings were burned. The Zohar describes it with an extraordinary expression, the heart of the world. Let's consider this metaphor for a moment. The heart is the organ that sustains the life of the body. From it circulates the blood that nourishes every part of the organism. Similarly, the altar was understood as the point from which spiritual vitality flowed to all of creation. But the mystical tradition goes even further. Some rabbinic sources maintain that the location of the altar was not just any point on the planet. It was aligned with the primordial site from which God began the creation of humanity. In other words, the temple was built on a place that possessed a cosmic memory. In the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah, for example, we find a fascinating teaching. It is suggested there that the dust from which Adam, the first human being, was formed came precisely from the place where the temple altar would later be erected. This is not merely a geographical curiosity. It is a profoundly significant symbolic statement. If humankind was created from that primordial dust, and if the altar stands at that very spot, then every sacrifice performed there represents more than just a religious ritual. It represents a return to the origin of humanity. The sacrificial act, in this view, symbolizes that humankind returns to the place where its history began. It returns to the point where matter was first transformed into human life. Therefore, the altar was not only the center of worship, it was the center of the spiritual world. When a person brought a korban to the temple, they were not simply participating in a rite. They were symbolically returning to the moment of creation. It was as if they were saying, "Just as I was formed from dust by divine will, now I return to that origin to restore my relationship with the Creator." And perhaps there we find one of the deepest insights of Jewish mysticism. Spirituality isn't just about looking to the heavens. Sometimes it's about returning to the point where our existence began. Because when human beings remember their origin, they also remember their purpose. There is a scene that played out every day in the Temple of Jerusalem. The fire of the altar consumed the offering, and slowly, a column of smoke began to rise toward the heavens. To the ordinary observer, This might have appeared to be simply the natural result of fire. But for Israel's mystical tradition, that smoke held a far deeper significance. Kabbalah views this moment as a powerful symbol of spiritual transformation. As the sacrifice was consumed by the fire, the smoke ascended upward. In the language of the Torah, this is often described as Rayach Nikoj Ladonai, that is, a pleasing aroma before God. However, the Kabbalists of the Zohar do not interpret this expression literally, as if the Creator were in need of sense. Rather, they see in this image a metaphor for spiritual movement. According to the Zohar, the smoke represents a process of elevation. First, the smoke rises from the altar. This vertical movement symbolizes the beginning of the spiritual return. That which resided on the material plane begins to undergo transformation. Next, as the mystical texts explain, this ascent traverses various spiritual levels. Kabbalistic tradition describes the existence of several worlds or dimensions, what Kabbalah would later term Olamot, interconnected spiritual worlds. The smoke of the sacrifice symbolizes the passage of spiritual energy through these levels. Finally, this energy reaches the higher worlds, where it reintegrates into the divine flow that sustains all of creation. Of course, the Kabbalists did not literally imagine a physical cloud traveling through the spiritual universe. The smoke serves as a symbolic language to describe something far more profound, the capacity of the material realm to transform into spiritual energy. The animal offered belongs to the physical world. The fire represents transformation, and the smoke expresses the outcome of that process, matter elevated toward the divine. In other words, the sacrifice dramatizes a fundamental spiritual truth. Human existence begins on the material plane, yet it possesses the potential to ascend. For this reason, within the Kabbalistic interpretation, the smoke rising from the altar represented far more than merely the sacrifice of an animal. It also represented the elevation of the human soul. The human being, like smoke, is born bound to the earth, yet possesses within himself the capacity to ascend. And perhaps that is why the mystics of Judaism gazed upon that smoke with such reverence. For in that column rising slowly toward the heavens, they saw an image of the human being's spiritual destiny, to transform the material into light, and to allow the soul to rise once more toward its origin. There is a statement in the Book of Leviticus that has intrigued generations of sages, philosophers, and mystics. The text declares directly, Ki nefesh habasar badam hai, that is to say, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Thus we find it in Leviticus 17 verse 11. In a literal reading, the verse establishes a theological foundation for the laws of sacrifice and for the prohibition against consuming blood. But when the mystical tradition examines this phrase, it uncovers a much deeper dimension. According to Kabbalah, the human being does not possess a single soul, but rather several levels of soul. Classical texts mention 5: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yekada. Each corresponds to a different level of consciousness and spiritual connection. The most basic level is called Nefesh. This is the aspect of the soul linked to biological life, to the vital energy that animates the body. It is the force that allows the heart to beat, the blood to circulate, and the body to live. For this reason, the mystical tradition associates the Nefesh precisely with the blood. In this interpretation, blood is not merely a physical element. It is the vehicle of vital energy, the material expression of that fundamental level of the soul. Now, let us consider the central moment of the sacrificial ritual. When the priest collected the animal's blood and placed it upon the altar, either on the horns of the mizbeach or by sprinkling it in specific places within the sanctuary, he was performing a gesture that Kabbalah interprets in a deeply symbolic manner. That act represented the return of vital energy to its divine source. The life that had been given over to the material world reconnected with the origin of all life. It was a movement of return, of reintegration. Thus, within the sacrificial system, blood becomes the central element of the ritual. It is not simply a technical detail of the procedure. It is the moment in which life itself is symbolically offered to the Creator. Mystics would say that the altar acted as a point of transformation. The vital energy of the physical world ascended once again toward the divine. And perhaps here we find one of the most profound insights of the Jewish tradition. Life, represented by blood, was never considered the absolute property of human beings. Life belongs, ultimately, to God. That is why the ritual of the altar constantly served as a reminder of an essential truth. Human existence is a sacred loan, and everything that lives, at some point, returns to its source. There is an element of the sacrificial system that was never to be extinguished. The Torah insists upon this with clarity. In the Book of Leviticus, it is commanded, Esh tamid tukat al hamizbij lo tijbi, that is, a perpetual fire shall burn upon the altar, it shall not be extinguished. Leviticus 6 verse 6. That fire was not merely a tool for burning the offerings. In the mystical interpretation of Judaism, that fire possesses a much deeper significance. Kabbalah teaches that the fire of the altar represents one of the fundamental attributes through which God manifests in the world, din, judgment. Din is the dimension of rigor, of strict justice, the principle that maintains the moral order of the universe. Within the structure of the Sefirot, this attribute is associated with the force that establishes boundaries, measures human actions, and demands accountability. Without din, the universe would descend into moral chaos. But here lies the central mystery of the sacrifice. When the animal was placed upon the altar and consumed by the fire, the Kabbalistic tradition understands that this act brought about a spiritual transformation. The fire of judgment did not merely destroy the offering, it transformed rigor into mercy. In Hebrew, mercy is called rachamim. The mystics explain that the sacrifice acted as a bridge between these two spiritual forces, judgment and compassion. The fire of the altar channeled din, but the act of surrender and repentance on the part of the offerer awakened rachamim. In this way, judgment was tempered. It did not vanish, for the moral order of the universe continues to exist, but it was balanced by divine compassion. In Kabbalistic terms, the altar functioned as a place where spiritual energies could be reordered. The fire purified, transformed, and elevated. For this reason, Kabbalah asserts that the fire of the altar did not merely consume the visible offering, it also purified reality itself. Disordered spiritual energies, brought about by human error, could be rebalanced through a sacrificial act performed with intention. Fire, then, was not merely destruction, it was transformation. And perhaps therein lies a deeply human lesson. We all face moments of judgment in life. Consequences, errors, limitations. Yet the Jewish tradition insists that judgment is not the end of the road. When there is awareness, responsibility, and return, even the fire of judgment can become a gateway to mercy. There is a teaching within Jewish mysticism that completely transforms our understanding of sacrifices. When we read the Torah literally, we see animals being offered upon the altar. But the masters of Kabbalah and Hasidism invite us to look deeper. They say, the sacrificial animal is not merely external to us, it also resides within us. Kabbalistic psychology explains that the human being possesses two inner dimensions. The first is the divine soul, what is called in Hebrew, neshama Elohit. This is the spiritual spark that aspires to truth, to compassion, and to connection with God. It is the part of us that seeks meaning, justice, and transcendence. Yet, alongside it exists another dimension, one that tradition calls nefesh behemet, literally, the animal soul. This is not, in itself, something negative. It is the instinctive dimension of life, the impulses for survival, desire, emotional energy, and the vital force we share with the rest of the animal kingdom. The problem arises when this energy is neither directed nor elevated. It may then manifest as unchecked ego, anger, ambition, or boundless desire. It is here that the mystical masters reinterpret the meaning of sacrifice. According to this reading, the animal placed upon the altar symbolizes precisely this instinctive dimension of the human being. The ritual act represents the transformation of the animal soul. The fire of the altar is not intended solely to consume an external creature. Rather, it symbolizes the elevation of our most primal impulses. The energy of the ego, of desire, and of passion must not be destroyed. It must be refined and directed toward the divine. For this reason, many Hasidic masters taught a startling idea. True sacrifice does not take place upon the altar of the temple. It takes place within the human heart. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, insisted that every person possesses their own inner altar. When a person transforms anger into patience, pride into humility, or selfish desire into generous love, they are performing a spiritual sacrifice. They are offering up their inner animal. In this sense, the system of Korbanot becomes a powerful metaphor for the spiritual life. Human beings are not called upon to deny their nature, but rather to elevate it. For the energy that can produce ego can also produce creativity. The passion that can turn into anger can also be transformed into love. The fire of the altar symbolizes this process of transformation, and perhaps that is why the Hasidic masters repeated a simple yet profound phrase. The most important sacrifice is the one that takes place within the soul. There is a linguistic detail in the Torah that reveals the deeper meaning of the entire sacrificial system. The word korban derives from the Hebrew root karav, which means to draw near. It signifies neither destruction, nor loss, nor ritual violence. It means, literally, drawing near. And that detail shifts the entire perspective. In the Kabbalistic reading, the secret of the korban lies neither in the animal offered, nor in the fire of the altar, nor even in the structure of the ritual itself. The true center of the sacrifice is the inner process of the one making the offering. The animal serves merely as symbolic language. The true movement takes place within the human being. According to the mystical masters, every korban entailed three fundamental spiritual movements. First, acknowledging one's error. The one making the offering had to confront themselves with honesty. Jewish tradition has always insisted that spiritual transformation begins with awareness. As long as a human being justifies their mistakes, they cannot change. The act of sacrifice compelled one to pause, reflect, and admit, I have failed. Second, the korban entailed subduing the ego. In Hebrew, the disordered ego is often associated with the pride that separates a human being from God and from others. The act of bringing an offering to the temple was a form of ritual humility, a recognition that life does not revolve solely around oneself. And third, the sacrifice represented the elevation of spiritual consciousness. The smoke rising from the altar symbolized the possibility that the human mind and heart could rise as well. The ritual served as a reminder that human beings are not condemned to remain at the most basic level of existence. They can grow, transform, and draw closer to the divine. For this reason, the Kabbalistic tradition arrives at a surprising conclusion. The temple altar was an external symbol of something far more profound. Ultimately, the true altar is the human heart. It is there that the most significant sacrifice takes place. It is there that pride can be transformed into humility, where error can become a lesson learned, and where consciousness can ascend towards something greater than oneself. Thus, the korban ceases to be merely an ancient ritual of the temple in Jerusalem. It becomes an eternal teaching. For drawing near to God, karav, does not depend on an animal or a stone altar. It depends on the moment when a human being decides to open their heart and begin to transform. If we look back at everything we have studied, we discover that the system of Korbanot was far more than just a collection of ancient rituals. It was a complex spiritual language that sought to teach human beings how to draw near to God. The Torah describes the sacrifices with great precision, the animals permitted, the role of the priests, the altar, the blood, and the fire. Yet, hidden behind these ritual details lies a central idea that permeates the entire tradition of Israel. The word korban derives from karav, which means to draw near, and that is the true heart of the entire system. The sacrifices taught that a relationship with God was not automatic. It required mindfulness, responsibility, and inner transformation. Through the Olah, we learn total surrender. With the Mincha, daily gratitude. With the Shalomim, harmony among God, the community, and the individual. With the Chadad, we grasp the possibility of rectifying our errors. And with the Asham, we learn that spirituality also demands that we repair the harm we have caused. The mystical tradition added yet another, even deeper dimension. According to Kabbalah, every sacrifice brought about tikkun, a spiritual rectification that restored the balance of the universe. The altar was viewed as the heart of the world, the smoke as the ascent of the soul, the blood as the vessel of life, and the fire as the point where judgment could be transformed into mercy. But the Hasidic masters took this a step further. They taught that true sacrifice does not occur solely upon the altar of the temple, but rather within the inner depths of the human being. Every time a person transforms their ego into humility, their anger into patience, or their selfishness into compassion, they are performing a korban, and perhaps that is the ultimate teaching of this entire tradition. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, and with it, the sacrificial system came to an end. Yet, the essence of the korban did not vanish. Rabbinic Judaism transformed it into prayer, study, and acts of justice. For, in the end, drawing near to God never depended solely upon an altar of stone. It depends on the moment when a human being decides to elevate their life and transform their own heart into a sacred space. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Thank you for placing your trust in us to study Torah together. This has been journalist Abel Flores, founder of Mishnah TV. Remember to subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and don't forget to visit our website, lemishnah.com. There, you will find a wealth of material on Second Temple Judaism, Kabbalah, Judeo-Christianity, and our free course covering the entire Mishnah, either chapter by chapter or in its summarized version, tractate by tractate. Shalom, shalom. And so that you may continue studying with us,